PTSD because that's what we have in the, our clinical vernacular. PTSI, the question is who renamed it? That's been used more by the military, the VA, and Joseph said that's being used more in law enforcement as well. I do a lot of teaching about stress first aid at work for our healthcare folks, and that really talks about stress injury, stress illness. They kind of get away from words like burnout and diagnoses, and stress first aid came from the military. That's from the National Center for PTSD, and they use the term stress injured and stress illness, and that's how I talk about it at work with my healthcare colleagues. So I think that's an interesting way for us to keep moving as a field to really understand thinking about trauma. So I don't want to belabor this too much. I just feel like we can't talk about trauma right now without acknowledging the influence of COVID-19 on how everyone in the world is functioning, and just recognizing, I think many of us have seen more distress spectrum we talked about. And I'm going to say classic PTSD, simple PTSD, single episode PTSD when I'm talking about the more classic version. And this is what I think of as actually what we used to talk about in DSM-3 and DSM-4 PTSD, is the more anxiety-based kind of PTSD that really benefits beautifully typically from our CBT, our cognitive behaviorally based approaches that are meant to really process a single episode of trauma, a terrible car accident, an assault, an experience at work, something that was one time, that wasn't an ongoing prolonged trauma. These treatments work really well for those kinds of traumas. And just a quick aside, a little soapbox moment, this kind of trauma is easier to study. That's why we have so many empirically validated treatments for it. Traditionally, now this is changing with our new DSM-5 diagnoses, symptom criteria. But in the past, if you think about what counted as PTSD and what support they need in the moment, so we don't ever want to get in the way of that natural process. For psychological first aid really means sort of assessing quickly who's navigating this okay and who needs more support. And you don't want to get in the way of things that are working for people. So this is a distinction between psychological first aid and something like the classic CISM or CISD, critical incident stress debriefing. Those modules are very prescriptive and kind of have a set way that you interact typically, at least the model that's been out there for a while. I don't know if they've adapted in the face of some of the data and research. It's not necessarily helpful to sit everybody down and make them talk about the trauma. And that's typically, at least in the traditional model of CISD, what was done. Psychological first aid is a more flexible approach that recognizes different people have different needs, and sometimes you need to get out of the way and let people do what's working for them. Part of that then is assessing the situation and kind of recognizing what happened, who was affected. 7 years of her life, all of her teen years and her early adult years were mostly in hospitals and always with this really tough symptomatology. There was a lot of substance use. She lost so much just in those experiences and kind of things she'll never get back. I had another client who had really severe trauma and psychotic symptoms that I saw in the hospital in her 50s. And she had just lived her life as sort of a sick person. And now in her 50s, there was all kinds of loss around, her parents who had died at some point when she was in a hospital, the loss of her own ability to have children herself. And that was just a big part of what also was intolerable for her. It was really like intense distress around some of those things. And the whole goal is changing the perspective of the trauma. What we talk about is that we want the trauma to not have the intensity and the centrality in somebody's life. So the trauma is not your defining feature. It's not the thing that you are. It's something that happened to you that you remember.